So I'm going to pull one together for you here. I'm going to talk about Superman, the advent of Superman, and when that occurs and why it occurs in an American civilizational historical context. And I'm going to connect that to Nietzsche and the concept of the will to power, as we've discussed in previous orations. And we're going to talk about, again, the fundamental characteristics and essence of the will. And I'll just kind of start there as the will as being something that's necessarily uncontained and uncontainable. And this is something we can observe phenomenologically through the process of species evolution, as well as the ritual overturning of the cosmos. It's well understood, even to a layperson, that what exists will cease to exist, that the order that's imposed cosmically due to a thermodynamic suspension or a pattern of circumstance will soon matriculate into a chaos, which will lead to a birth of a new paradigm. And this is essentially the movement of history. You have these patterns of paradigmatic emergences where there are energetic conditions and circumstances which foster life in a certain status or in a certain way, and allow the genetic script or the historical circumstance to exist for a period of time, such as the agrarian conditions of early America, plantation slavery. But you have these ritual overturnings, which are overturnings of consciousness. And when we say overturnings of consciousness, what we're really talking about is a paradigm shift in the thermodynamic circumstances in an ecosystem, which lead to a matriculation into a new paradigm. What we experience now in, we'll say, the United States and in the global condition, in a post-industrial, highly super technological society, in the year of 2025, we're witnessing an animal phenomenon, an animal event, which is a response to a set of rapidly shifting ecological circumstances, both in terms of the ritual technology, which provides the image basis and the cultural and social basis for our society in terms of how we communicate and create the symbols and signs which we ritually respond to, and thus are the basis of our everyday lives in a human anthropological sense, but also in a deeper sense and in direct relation, the ecological and ecosystemic circumstances, which are themselves a paradigm shift, again, thermodynamically in terms of a degree of temperatures, a shifting ecosystem in terms of a emergence of a new paradigm of volatility due to the literal shifts ecologically in the climate. So to return this to Superman and the will, what we're looking at with the advent of Superman, which, of course, again, in no coincidence, is invented at the outset and in the midst of World War II as a political conundrum. And we talked about the discovery of Pluto astronomically and the archetype of Pluto and what it means for humanity itself to become conscious of the planet subsequently named Pluto. Again, you have to understand history and phenomenology. Life itself is not a series of random circumstances insofar as we understand simultaneously scientifically in a quantum mechanical sense and mythically in a mystical sense or a Gnostic sense or a spiritual sense, that all phenomena are interconnected and lead back to the same source and root, which is the phenomenological character of all existence, as we discussed with Heraclitus' axiom of the aeon or eternity as a child to play with colored balls. But we're going to suspend that axiom and we're going to move forward into the Nietzschean paradigm, which is highly reflective upon Heraclitus, but is a modern update of Heraclitus and the phenomenology of the will. And Nietzsche's interpretation, which again I would say is accurate in an experimental sense in relation to Heraclitus, is that the will is always already a will to power. And what a will to power means is an emergence of the will into perennially new circumstances, is that the will always breaks the hold of the character of the form of the being, which is always already temporarily in construction, in utero, a process which is being destroyed by the emergence of new phenomenological possibility, new perceptive possibility, new ontological possibility as it emerges natively through the development of the organism, the development of the process of play universally. This is something that is occurring in time. And so when we get to World War II, which really in many ways is the birth of technological modernity, particularly through war device, right, through war technology, this is a massive update of war technology that occurs in the span between World War I and World War II and as well as the industrial reproduction of the particularly the American war machine, but the global war machine in terms of capacity of force. So we understand that technologically. But I want to elucidate this movement more foundationally in terms of a radical phenomenology of the will that emerges in modernity in a specifically American context. And this is symbolized by the creation of the character of Superman. And so what we need to understand about Superman is that Superman is a device to elucidate the underpinnings of this rapidly emerging consciousness, which is actually, it's subconscious in the sense that it emerges through culture, it emerges through symbol, and it emerges in history as a ahistorical device. And so that's what I mean by archetype, in that an ahistorical device is something that's primary to history and is actually mediating consciousness as it appears in the world. It's between the utterly essential, which is the pre-symbolic realm, and the immediate phenomenological circumstances of history as it is an emergent phenomenon being influenced by the prehistorical, pre-symbolic realm, which is itself the essential energetic force of the will, as elucidated by Nietzsche as always already a will to power. And so what we understand with Superman in the characteristics that Superman elucidates and embodies is a full-scale consolidation of the historical mythological archetype of heroism, updated for the modern age in the sense that Superman embodies all of the characteristics of a fully realized transcendental will, embodied physically in the appearance of a human being. And this is precisely the symbolic meaning of Superman being an alien, is that Superman appears to be human, but in fact is not human. And this is an ontology of humanity itself, and I'll explain this because this is it's a subconscious, implicit recognition of the fundamental transcendental force of the will emergent through the appearance of the human being, which is actually primary and primordial to humanity, which necessarily means that the human being itself is inhuman or is founded by a source that is transcendent or transcendental or suprahuman beyond the human being. And this is precisely what the term superhuman means in terms of a modernization of heroism. Again, the mythological hero such as Perseus or Hercules or Inanna. These are the gods and goddesses which populated the ancient civilizational context and elucidated in many different ways and forms what the transformation of the will is and signifies and means. And so you have this pop cultural form, which again is the American mythology of Superman, the characterization of Superman, which is the total elucidation of a transcendental power of the will and the force of the will emergent in and through the human being form. And this is what is utterly necessary at this moment in time in human history because, again, the discovery of Pluto astronomically cannot be divorced by the cultural recognition, the reckoning of consciousness that occurs in the expansion of an awareness or a perception of space-time reality, which is also a perception and awareness of supra-space-time consciousness. And this needs to be understood and can again be understood by the philosopher Blaise Pascal's journal entry, a very brief notation, almost a footnote in his journals, where he says God is the cultural limit. So we need to understand this, that consciousness itself as a formation and an emergent phenomenon as it occurs at a species level is inseparable from the phenomenological conditions and circumstances which themselves are an elucidation on a day-to-day basis, both through individuals and through mass forces of global subjectivities such as nation states, of this state of being or this state of awareness, which is a reproduction primarily of that which is being experienced psychologically. So when you have the appearance of Superman historically, you have the appearance of this figure who is actually symbolizing the conflict of World War II itself, the deep ideological conflict of World War II, which is this call to ethnic supremacy in Nazi Germany, which itself is representative of this greater force of the assertion of existential will being filtered through phenomenological conditions and circumstances, which is the attempt, as we see historically across effectively all empires and the vast majority of ancient civilizations, this attempt to conquer through the vision of the world itself. This again is something that can be directly related to Alexander the Great and ancient Rome, just as it can be related to Genghis Khan and the Mongols and the entire history of the conquering empire as well as the colonizing empire, which is a modernization or a pseudo-modernization of this ancient historical phenomenon. We're looking at the organizing order of the cosmos reflected through the world historical form as an order and an organization and a power structure. An elucidation and a war to elucidate the powers of being. And if you understand this in a human sense, or you understand this in an ape sense, or a monkey sense, or a genetic single-celled organism sense, we're discussing the attempted emergence through, and this is the importance of Darwin again, through the species form as an evolutionary device which is recombinated sexually. The attempted emergence of the full powers of the will, which are always already in this paradoxic contradiction delimited by the aperture through which they emerge, which is the human being or the jungle cat or the flower. And this itself, this urge and this need toward reproduction is symbolic in a supernatural sense of the will to power continually and persistently emergent, again in a supernatural sense, from that which is beyond the phenomenological appearance of nature as in an essential characteristic of nature itself. And this is where we connect Heraclitus and Nietzsche, is that we understand in the recombinative play of the child, again, the aeon or the eternal or the universal is a child at play with colored balls. We are also understanding that the nature of play is necessarily evolutionary. Is that play is structuring itself by building upon itself to elucidate something which is necessarily beyond itself. The primary conditions of play are a experimentation of realization of that which has previously not yet been realized from the circumstances prior. And this is what I mean by evolutionary paradigm shifting status of revelation, which is common to history and common to the evolution of species itself, and thus by nature is standard and common to the evolution of the will in a greater cosmological space-time that we can observe phenomenologically everywhere at all times as an essential characteristic and trait. Is that this underturning or this overturning, which you could also characterize it as an underturning, as in a turning out from under into form, of the essence of the will as this entity or this force that continually surmounts the form upon which it was previously placed, is symbolic of the historical form and the Gnostic form of the Ouroboros, the snake that eats its own tail and thus generates more life-giving energy by consuming that which remains from it, or that last linkage of it. And this is the scaffolding of history and how the cosmos sustains itself. And again, this is a characteristic that is common to the birth and death of stars and star systems. This is a characteristic that's common to the metabolic principles of energetic digestion and consumption on the planet Earth. And this is also what is so interesting symbolically in the figure of Superman in terms of how Superman regenerates his life force energy, which is the exposure to the orange sun of planet Earth. He's receiving profound superstructural metabolic energy directly through the sun's radiation, which is a bypassing of the traditional system of transportation of energy through which human beings ingest via food or water. And again, this is a breaking of the symbolic chain and the symbolic order. This is what's important to realize about the archetype of Superman, which again, I would say this is pretty explicitly implicit historically, in the sense that this is something that's emerging unconsciously, but is actually revealing something superordinate and entirely profound about the nature of modern human consciousness as it reflects upon itself through the ancient mythological lenses updated for the modern pop cultural age of American civilizational history, is that Superman is a subversion of the symbolic order or the symbolic chain of being, in the sense that Superman is primarily and primordially representative of the ontological force of the will itself proper, prior to its distillation, filtration, translation, and digestion down into subordinate forms, which are attempting to climb up the metaphysical and metaphorical superstructural scaffolding of existence and being itself to retain and obtain this essential power of the will itself proper, which is the transcendental force which is always already overturning all forms of being as they exist. And again, I'm just going to use the Blake quote. It's the narrow chinks in the cavern. Man sees through narrow chinks in his cavern. If he were to see all that was as it is, he would realize that that existence was eternal. And this is common to the metaphysicians who are also always already mystics. And this is a reason why you'll understand, or you'll see in these in quasi spiritual formulations, that there's this conceptual idea that man will eventually stop eating and drinking and just receive his energy directly from the sun. And again, this is why Superman is almost a Gnostic concept and is directly related to the Nietzschean Übermensch, which we'll get to soon, is that we're looking at this attempt which is common to all of life, which is to return to the source and the essential force of life. Return to that which it is in terms of its primordial identity, and thus cease to perceive through this fractured, fragmented lens. And again, as Da Vinci said, realize that everything is connected to everything else. And Galileo says that wine is a mixture of water and sunlight, right? We're attempting to penetrate the veil and the valence of the appearance of the Newtonian universe, which is nothing more or less than the phenomenological physical universe, and the principles which undergird it, which are the apparent functions of that which moves. The movement of the earth and the sun, for instance, or the movement of the rustling of the tree's leaves, right? We're attempting to penetrate into that essential inner force, or that inner state or status of nature and existence itself, and realize ontologically and close this perceptible separative gap between, let's say, the existence of the individual or the one who inquires with the universal whole. So when I say Superman is superordinate and thus superhuman, this concept of superhuman is directly tied to the cosmic hero of the ancient civilizational lore and the source of all mythology in ancient history, is that there is already an incarnation of that form, and this is the Christic element of Superman, is that Superman is an incarnation of the God body or the Godhead or the God form, as would be described as Vishvarupa or Krishna in the Hindu. This is meant to represent, in an American modern sense, the possibility of the total transcendence of the will as it is prior subordinated into the human form, which is necessarily fallible by mortality or basic physical functions of strength and force. And thus Superman is depicted historically, particularly in the series of 1940 Superman gum cards, which I think are really fascinating, depicted overcoming these traditions which could be described as the banal disasters of human existence, such as battling a hurricane or escaping a mine disaster, right? Or engaging even in terms of warfare, and defying bullets, right? Defying missiles and torpedoes. The conditions which elucidate this profound human crisis, this profound existential crisis of the fallibility of the human body and form, in the attempt to reconcile that fallibility with this inner transcendental knowledge of the higher nature, which is to say the cosmic nature or the essential force of will, as it is manifest and embodied in a temporal form and an apparatus which necessarily, as is the nature of all paradigms, species, civilizations, and star systems, to be overturned into chaos, which is the emergence of something different, something perhaps stranger, and even perhaps more evolved in its own way through the scaffolding of cosmological experience, which is the extension of universal time from the moment of the birth of space-time. at least in this formation, which you could describe as this universe, this particular unfolding that is occurring, which is again a thermodynamic thermonuclear exchange of this essential stellar cosmic information, as is elucidated even in a pseudo microcosmic sense down from the star system which undergirds the Earth, the Sun, Pluto, Mars, and Venus, and dictates their orbit. So this is why when we're looking at this confluence of the archetypal figure of Pluto, which is the figure of transformation and utter foundational transformation, stripping paradigms down to their essential energetic roots as they overturn and become something different, which if you look at the archetype in the ancient Greek and connect it directly scientifically to the death of stars and the rebirth of a new star from the cloud of the death of the old star, we're also looking at the end of empires. We're looking at the end of civilizations. We're looking at the end of human life. We're looking at the moment in which the form itself ceases to exist and becomes again the formless, and then a new form, as in a paradigm shift or a transformation, occurs or is revealed. And you have the poet Yeats at the onset of this early modern paradigm write the poem "The Second Coming." What beast comes slouching from Bethlehem? This is a symbolic concept of the emergence of the Plutonian will, something grotesque, horrific, transcendent, terrifying, emergent, unknown, extreme, sublime, that is appearing out from this wilderness, this cover of darkness, which Heraclitus says is the midnight of human history, also again articulated directly in this paradigm, coming into the 1930s. This midnight of human history, which is clearly a ontological appearance, a revelation of this death and rebirth cycle, this moment, this pinnacle of transformation in which the ontological foundations of societies down to their religious structures, which always already elucidate a meaning of human being, the spiritual form in which humanity takes, are shifting. They're becoming nihilistic. They're becoming emptied out, which is articulated in the coming decade and decades with the emergence of existentialist philosophy into the 1940s and 1950s. And Superman occupies this position between Heidegger and the emergence of existentialist philosophy, which is to say World War II itself. And this is what's so important about the archetypal figure of Superman is, again, when we're talking about continental philosophy, we're talking about something that it does not necessarily include America. And I would argue as a modern formulation, a strictly modern formulation in terms of the age of American civilization itself and when it comes of age, which is to say the early to mid 1900s, in terms of as a world superpower, a conscious cultural formulation, a coming formulation of America's identity, what defines America, which I would say for the most part is industrialization, in a revolutionary consciousness, which exists prior to that in its founding, however flawed. What philosophy fails to capture, or the tradition of Western civilizational philosophy and historical philosophy, fails to capture the American innovations and revolutions that occur within it, which we have elucidated thus far via the history of baseball as America's pastime. We've used a little bit of basketball, talking about the phenomenological emergence of being through the act in basketball of dunking, flight consciousness. And we're taking flight consciousness even further into the archetypal symbolic realm through the characterization and manifestation of Superman as something that, again, is existent more firmly in the symbolic order in terms of as an archetype and not as a historical force, right? As a archetype emergent through history, which is culture. That is an abstraction, a concept, a theorization, and necessarily a higher manifestation of this essential transcendental force which is emerging into human consciousness at this moment in time in human history. And when we're looking at Superman, we're looking at the fraughtness of this revelation of the vacuum, the existential ideological vacuum of the will to power in relation to the overturning of civilizations and paradigms, the emergence of the will to power nakedly and natively into the socio-political and cultural atmosphere, which is effectively the story over and over again of Superman, this tension between being a metaphysical superhuman force or an alien force that is incarnated into life on Earth or sent in a ship to Earth and thus is born and raised on Earth effectively. And the tension between being this essential cosmological primordial will, which is transcendental even of the perceptible physical conditions, mortality, the ability to exert force through a human body, the ability to resist the speeding bullet or the speeding train, these are all manifestations of extreme force which the human body cannot traditionally withstand. The tension between the appearance of this body, which appears to be human, the origins, which are ontologically superhuman as an alien, as an extraterrestrial, and we discussed the meaning of extraterrestrial, beyond the land, beyond the phenomenological formation, which appears to be, it's something superordinate. And the terms which Superman is attempting to negotiate, which is this super willing state of supremacy over the apparent forces of nature, which previously or do control and dictate in large part the possibilities of humanity. And this is the same tension that you see emergent through the Nazi mythology, as well as the mythologies of American exceptionalism, the exponential powers of American industrial capitalism, and what emerges from that rapidly scaling architecture of civilization. Right? These are just the architectural conditions of modern American civilization. What is emergent from that is a clearer and clearer and clearer elucidation of this profound and perhaps terrifying realization where humanity itself is just this primordial negotiation in relationship to its realization of this source form, which you have at the outset of the 1900s, you have an increase of the movement of ancient Hindu and Vedantic thought across the ocean to lecture in America, including Krishnamurti and Vivekananda. So there's a cultural infusion on top of already the Christian ideas, which are a large part of American history, as well as the fraught conflict of World War II, which is a historical manifestation of this symbolic consciousness problem, as well as the history of Western phenomenology and continental philosophy, which at this moment in time is elucidating this problematic void at the heart of being, and all that emerges from it is this primordial force, which is scaffolding existence through this perennial evolution and overturning of all of the forms. As well, as well as what you could say in this moment, a real confrontation of the limits and limitations of the human being in relation to the emergent technologies, particularly the atom bomb, which are rapidly outsourcing the limited physical incarnate human existence and human condition, which themselves, this technology is representative of this existential primordial primary drive, which is the emergence of the transcendental ontological will itself through the powers of the human being in the attempt to create something superordinate, which is itself manifest or itself expressed. And again, through the limitations of the human being, which requires food, water, sleep, shelter, right? These essential basic conditions, which continually throughout modernity in American history in particular, reveal themselves as that which is being discarded. The human condition itself is being forgotten. It's being released and relinquished in the name of this absolute power drive, or this will to power, which itself is the destructive force, as is described by Freud in the term of thanatos. And again, this is a huge part of the emergence of psychology at the turn of the century into the 1930s. both with Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung, the idea that within and as the psyche there is something superordinate. And that superordinance is seeking emergence through the terms of the everyday and the body, whether that is through dreams, whether that is through symbolism, whether that is through the sex drive. And all of these are different ways of saying there is something that's obscured or obfuscated at the foundation of humanity, which is seeking to emerge culturally, historically, expressively through the conditions of the human being in space-time. That is necessarily the death of and the end of the human being in terms of the end of the paradigm of the human species itself. And this is something that's understood perhaps catastrophically or tragically as latent in the human consciousness itself, and is something that very few individuals historically have been willing to confront, right? Because to face this power is to face the power of destruction just as much as it is the power of creation. This is the mythological archetype in ancient Hinduism of the goddess Kali, which is the goddess of death, but also in death, the radical and transformative possibility of a more meaningful and a deeper life, a more essential life, which is the relationship between Kali and Shiva, who is being himself, the stillness of being. What is necessary in a space-time sense and in an evolution of consciousness sense, which is to say the transcendental essence of the will, is for this destruction to necessarily unfold and occur. And this is the terrifying realization that you will see excerpted in different expressions and forms of speech which become popular or contemporary, which is to say a latency of the human being's recognition of the human being always already becoming outmoded by the very nature of its existence itself in space-time. Because the human being is always necessarily seeking through life the escape velocity to transcend life, which is to say to transcend the historical, material, and primordial conditions which temporarily assemble it, which is to say the evolution of the genetic structure of the human being in space-time, as it is grounded gravitationally upon the force of the earth. So you have space projects, you have political projects, you have the project of flight and flight consciousness. These are all different ways that the human being itself is seeking escape from its condition. And this is an essential part of the thought of Sartre and his play No Exit, as well as with Samuel Beckett. Because what is being understood there, again, this is the paradigm of Pluto. Everything that we're discussing here is couched within the discovery astronomically of Pluto as a new cultural limit, a new astronomical limit in terms of the furthest out that the human being can perceive the cosmos, and as such, that is directly mirrored archetypally in the farthest out that the human being can perceive the ontology of the psyche itself as a formulation that stretches from the deepest cosmos to the realm of the dream. This is the axiom of Da Vinci. Understand that everything is connected to everything else. So when we have that emergence of that Plutonic paradigm, what we have the emergence of is the terror and the absolute fear which is manifest historically in the greatest war that humanity has ever experienced, the most tragic and vicious war in world human history, which is the hyper-advanced industrial World War II, both in terms of the genocide of the Holocaust and culminating in the dropping of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And the dropping of the atomic bombs are a terrifyingly fitting analogical and symbolic device historically and materially for the revelation itself. It's the most pure distillation historically and materially of the revelation of Pluto itself, which is the harnessing of the essential atomic power of the cosmos at the most microcosmic superstructural level and transforming that essential power and force of energy, the force and energy of suns, as is so often described historically by the physicists and observers of the unfolding of this phenomenon. The harnessing of the power of suns, again, much like Superman, we have to understand this symbolically, in order to create this massive, 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 unprecedented form of destruction, which is the manifestation of a force of will which has hitherto never appeared on the face of the earth insofar as we can understand historically, other than that the striking of a comet upon the earth, which is a cosmological force Again, as in the terms of Superman, a cosmological force emerging from beyond, right? Extraterrestrial force. Superordinate universal force emergent from beyond, conveying this terrifying superordinate power upon the phenomenological conditions and existential conditions of the human being, which are necessarily limited and delimited by the physical form, which is mortality, death, and impermanence. It's a temporary paradigmatic status of the evolution of the genome, and by nature, the evolution of the cosmic energy of the universe itself into untold formulations, decouplings, and potential reformulations. So these are all the same thing. These are all manifestations of the subliminal divine, which is the ontological primordial power of the energy itself. So when we're looking at Superman, this is actually a cultural prescience unto the actual historical material appearance of the atom bomb. Because this is a terrifying power which is jurisdicted by world governments and it is harnessed as a world-stopping, war-stopping force, much like Superman, and this is the entire ontology and archetype of Superman, in the attempt to rein in and harness this force, which no one really has control over, but has control over itself because it is the primordial. It's the child at play with colored balls. It's the terrifying realization that the child at play with colored balls is the same order that organizes a single-celled organism in the abyss of ancient oceans, just as much as it organizes the historical form of the dinosaur or the shark or the cannibal, right? Of these powerfully consumptive forms of terror, which are a face of Kali. Kali has two faces, the wrathful and the divinely pleasant, maybe, or the benevolent. And what this is meant to show is to understand that the two-sided die, or the Janus face of this cosmological primordial power of play, which simultaneously, again, depending on perspective or orientation, appears absolutely terrifying and all-consuming and all-destructive in terms of the consumption, digestion, and reproduction of energetic forms, this continual death and rebirth cycle, or it appears entirely benevolent, as in the experimentation of consciousness, as in the child at play with colored balls. And there's a great Schopenhauer quote, and I'll paraphrase it, where he says, when you see or observe something terrifying in humanity, you take it as if you were a mineralogist studying a mineral or studying a stone. You just observe this trait of being, right? And this is something that's so powerful and is so primary to philosophy as the ancient and the modern science, the true science, the existential and metaphysical science, because it is to take the nature of being and the nature of existence itself and to take it with the phenomenological distance of an inquirer or a scientist or one who observes, and to understand this primordial connection and to understand the duality within it is actually a synthesis in terms of the overturning, which is primary to historically the importance of the human being. And this is something that to the human being is unconscionable or tragic, because the human being, the entire order of the human being, culturally and organismically, in terms of the biology of the organism and the symbolism it creates around itself, is all to affirm life, and its importance in the order of the universe itself. And this is something that emerges a little later in the century, again, in the important history of American philosophy as it emerges culturally through the pop culture philosophy and science of Carl Sagan, to understand that the entirety of American civilization is run by science and technology. That's what actually powers the superordinate force of will, which creates the modern American political stage, right, in terms of war technology, war industry, as well as the emergent technological products in American civilization, including AI, the cell phone, the company Apple or Google, right, these massive corporate entities which are harnessing technology and science to create the political, social, and cultural conditions of American civilization, just as much as the war machine, in terms of an industrial force, created the American position in World War II. he seeks to position the human consciousness where it should rightfully be, which is a node within this grand cosmological order, which is actually a reorientation of the subjective infrastructure of the human being, which Freud would simply call the will structured as superego, ego, and id as a complex, which is symbolized historically as the ego being Jesus Christ ascending towards God, which is the superordinate or the superego, which is itself the evolutionary power of the cosmic will, away from the devil, which would be the disorganizing force of the will, towards destruction and dissolution. This is an ontological mapping of a spiritual journey of the self towards primordial union, but necessarily and implicitly in that formulation, there's an integration of the chaotic and destructive force of dissembly, which is necessarily a part of evolution, with the superordinate powers of the will, an integration of the two faces of Kali. The terrifying overturning which reduces the human being to a genetic marker or a place in time in the grand evolution of the cosmos, which is a primordial unveiling of Yeats's beast slouching toward Bethlehem, and the title of the poem being Second Coming is no coincidence. And the terrifying power of the emergence of Superman as it is envisioned in the American cultural consciousness as a superordinate power which necessarily renders, as is said many times in the comics and the movies, renders humanity irrelevant or useless or empty or purposeless, because this is the revelation of the grand teleology and the total force of the will as a metaphysical construct which could only be gestured to symbolically previously. It's the revelation in an embodied sense through a phenomenological character, a literal being, a literal form and existence, doing work in a physical sense of Superman himself. And so this revelation or this second coming or this presence of being is itself that which revolutionizes the entire cultural, historical, and political consciousness of the American nation or civilization itself. And this is precisely what we're talking about when we gesture into and move into World War II. We're talking about the emergence of a paradigm of historical and material conditions culminating in the dropping of the atom bomb, which necessarily reorganize an entire formerly agrarian, localized political consciousness into a high technological, high force, high apparition of will modern age, which is immediately secularized and globalized to such an extent that the reverberations of the conflicts initiated in this early modernity, including World War I, which there we're talking about the creation of the State of Israel. We're looking at the repercussions 100 years into the future, 80 years into the future, of the revelation of this grand transformative power and force and thrust of Superman, which we could say here is this American symbological cultural figure of Pluto, which is meant to symbolize the Plutonic essence, which is the transformative force of being beneath all phenomenological appearance, as in an aperture or a veil of being, or the chinks in the cavern of humanity, and the repercussions of the revelation of this force. Whether that's historically through World War II, materially through World War II, or culturally through Superman. And this is what's powerful about Superman, is that because it's an archetypal revelation of the historical and material force which is emergent at that period of time, again, visualized cosmologically most clearly in the discovery of Pluto, which means that humanity has become conscious of this mythological archetype in so many words. Again, there are no coincidences in history. If you understand history at the grand evolutionary, genetic, and supergenetic in terms of the cosmological unfolding of all life sense, you understand it as symbolic orders, which are manifestations and translations of this primary force of will down through concentric circles or spheres, which are different ordinations of that same manifestation. In the same way that you could say, you would say the atom bomb is an ordination. an expression or explosion or expulsion of force, and we're just asking, what is the essential characteristic and nature of that force? What is the essential nature and force of the will of being itself, and thus the character of being, as it manifests in these various different drives, as in the assembly of star systems, or the assembly of historical material phenomena, which are reflected and refracted through and with the greater species consciousness of humanity itself. So that's what I got. I'll catch you on the next one.